Hello, everybody. It's Heath Robinson back again with world traveler and photographic professional Joel Wolfson. He's going to be presenting artistic visualization from concept to final image.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've done a webinar, but I'm excited to be back and welcome everyone. Those of you, especially in faraway places that might be in time zones at some ungodly hour, thanks for joining us. I've got some new ideas to share with you that I think and hope will really help your photography and processing. So before I get started, for those of you that don't know, I provide a number of different educational resources, most of them free. In addition to webinars like this, I also write articles, do reviews, blog posts, presentations, workshops, etc. And the best way to keep informed about all this is to subscribe to my newsletter, which you can do on my website, and I will show you what that looks like. On any of the pages on my website, you can sign up on the left there where it says email address. But I just wanted to show you this other page too. I have a tab for photographers, so that has all kinds of learning stuff, an archive of all these webinars, discounts, stuff like that. So just wanted to point that out to you. Now, I've done a lot of webinars for Topaz, and typically I have a particular theme and take you through some of the images from start to finish, which I'll do today, but I also want to try approaching things a bit differently in the sense I want to incorporate not just the process from start to finish, but the creative thinking behind the images. Now, obviously, I can't include hands-on involvement in creative exercises like I might do in my workshops because you all are scattered around the world and we're limited on time, but I will give you some ideas to practice, and that should help to hone your visualization skills, or if you're a beginner at visualization, it'll help with that as well. And I can also impart what goes into an image in addition to the tools and processes in Studio. So those of you that read the description for this webinar saw a quote from Ansel Adams with his definition of visualization: the ability to anticipate a finished image before making the exposure. And I want to expand on that, and I can do that with another one of his quotes. It's one of my favorites, and that is, the negative is the score and the print the performance. And I think his music analogy fits perfectly also in a modern day sense, because we're still talking about the whole process from start to finish. I think we all acknowledge that capturing a meaningful image is a creative process, but so is processing the image. And although many of us still make prints, even if you don't, you still have to process your image, particularly if you shoot RAW. And those of you that have heard me do these before, you know I always say RAW is blah, so you need to process it to optimize your image just to get it back to the way you saw it. And in my opinion, taking the image all the way through to the final result is all part of the creative process. So all of these things relate to each other. What I love about Topaz is that they have their roots in the creative process. And when you look at some of their tools, even going way back, it's obvious they think outside the box. So I work with a lot of different software, and I do that on a daily basis. But there are a few things that no one else has except Topaz, like Glow and Impression and Restyle, not to mention things like Abstraction, Smudge, and many more. So to relate all this back to visualization, which is our first step in the creative process, we have all these great tools that give us endless possibilities for our final result, or what Ansel Adams would call the performance. So it's a matter of just keeping these in mind. And if you want to hone your visualization skills, ask yourself this question: what compelled me to put the camera to my eye? And if you can zero in on that, you'll be much better prepared to do the kind of processing you need if you want to convey that story or emotion when you get to the computer. So I'm going to take you through this with this first image here. And here's a nice black and white landscape from Tuscany. And from a visualization standpoint, I had to look at a color scene in front of me and visualize it in my mind's eye, like this. So let me show you the original raw capture, which looks quite a bit different. And as you can see, it's exposed more or less for the middle tones. The sky looks washed out, but there is detail there. So I'm going to show you how I went from this point basically to this black and white, which is what I imagined in my head. And the reason is, just to give you the background on it and how I thought about this from the beginning forward, is all these rolling hills, and what really struck me in the scene. I mean, Tuscany is beautiful and it has these beautiful rolling hills all over, but it was also, I had some nice light that day with this storm moving in and the dappled light on the fields, and I wanted a way to communicate that. So that's where this all started. And in fact, I'm going to show you the first of I call them visualization exercises. Now, some of you are better at this than others, but I think some of these techniques really help. So the first thing to do is look at your scene. Now, I recommend using a tripod if you're going to do this, because part of it is closing your eyes. So what you can do is you set up your camera, and at this point, you know, you've already made some decisions because you have the angle of view, your perspective, having chosen a lens, a focal length, an aperture for depth of field, and orientation is going to also determine backlighting, side lighting, front lighting, that sort of thing. Now, if you're just starting out doing this, I recommend using more or less a static subject that isn't going to change too quickly. If you're dealing with a moving subject or light that's changing very quickly, it's a little harder to do this. So, just put your camera, your finger on the shutter, close your eyes, try to envision what it's going to be, and then just compare it to what you have on your LCD, or if you have an electronic viewfinder like in a mirrorless, you're getting this right off the bat when you look through the image. Doing that with black and white takes it a step further, and a little bit later on I'm going to show you another little exercise you can do to kind of hone this further. So let me take you through, now you kind of know the background of what I was thinking when I saw this, and I'll take you through the steps in terms of how I got there. Now I'm in Topaz Studio here, just a super quick overview of the interface. We have effects on the left, and effects are combinations of adjustments that allow you kind of a one-click way to get what you see in these previews, and they're in categories. If I click on the column thing here, you can see all the different categories, and I have one called My Effects, so any effects you see, and you can save these effects. So and then you can just scroll through these, pick the one you want and click on it, and that's a good way to get a starting point. It also actually helps with the visualization skills too. So and then you create the actual adjustments on the right. And then in the lower left here are sort of, at least the first three are things that you would normally do probably before you start the image, start working on the image and adding adjustments. I like to do cropping first. Even if you don't know a precise crop, it helps to do a rough crop at least first, because you don't want extraneous information affecting your judgment on what you're doing with your adjustments. So I'm not cropping severely here. Mainly when I looked at this scene, I had to do kind of a mental crop because I was using a camera that has a 4:3 ratio. I mentally cropped it to something like this. I had to include a little extra because I really more or less wanted a sort of a 3:2 ratio. So then when you're done, you can just hit done over here. This has all the usual cropping aspects to it, the angle, and you can set up aspect ratios, all those things. I'm not going to go into that because it's pretty standard stuff. So we start with a crop, and I'm going to show you one more tool just because I think this one is better than what I've seen in a lot of other programs. For instance, if you use Lightroom, they have a clone tool, but this is just to clone out dust spots or various things like that. But this one's fairly sophisticated. Let me zoom in. And I'm going to grab this healing tool, and you can see the circle is the brush size. It's way too big right now, and I'm just going to adjust it down a fair amount here. make it kind of small. And there's this power pole here, and I'm just gonna go over that. And you'll see it uses what's around it, and it actually matched up the tire tracks and everything. So it's it works pretty well. I've got one more little one I can do right here. And these probably, you know, wouldn't be much of a factor in showing up later on in the scene when you know, when I do a print, because they're so small and kind of blend in with the landscape. But I just thought it was a good opportunity to show you how to get rid of some of those things that you might encounter in your pictures and dust spots and that sort of thing. This one works quite well. So as you can see here, I don't have a lot of detail on that sky, so I wanna kind of take a look and see what I can do here. The first thing I want to do though is kind of normalize this. It's very lackluster because it's a raw image. So I'm done with the healing brush here. My first adjustment, and I do this quite often, is a tone curve. And this is all the ones above this line here are the ones that come with Studio, and the ones below are the ones, the pro adjustments that you can purchase, and I'll be showing several of those today. So I like tone curves because I can do what might take 3 or 4 sliders, say in the basic adjustments like contrast and shadow and highlight and that sort of thing. I can do it all in one. So those of you that aren't familiar with curves, dark values on the left, bright values on the right, and it's divided into quadrants. And so I usually just do kind of an S-shaped curve. So I just take down the shadows a little bit, bump up the highlights a little bit, and I adjust these so that the center point sort of stays in the center. And this is all assuming that I have a fairly decent exposure. The other thing I often do will bring is that I bring in the light point, the black point right here on the left. And that just gives me a little more contrast. So, and with any of these adjustments, which sort of appear in layers on the right here, you can click on the little eyeball, turn it off to see what effect that had. So this just sort of normalizes a little bit. Now, I still have a lot of work to do, especially bringing some detail back in the sky. And so the next thing I'm going to do is just bring up a basic adjustment. And what you can do, especially when you have an image like this with a broad dynamic range, is to see what detail is there. If you look at an LCD at the back of your camera when you shoot this, it might look similar to this, and you'll say, oh, my sky's all washed out, I have to do HDR, or I have to, you know, try some different exposures. And you're welcome to do that, but you'd be surprised how much dynamic range a modern camera really holds. So what I'm going to do is, as I bring this exposure slider down, I can see the highlight detail, and if I go the other way, I can see, say, the detail in those dark areas like the hills and whatnot. But you can see when I bring this all the way down to the left, I actually have quite a lot of detail in those clouds that you wouldn't know just by looking at that base raw exposure. So I actually kind of like the clouds with this drastic slider here. I don't normally go all the way to one extreme, but in this case, I like that detail in the clouds. Now, the way I can bring the rest back is by masking. So in all of these adjustments, there's a little plus symbol, and that brings down a whole masking panel. The masking in Studio is pretty amazing. It's I can't think of anybody that has has more tools than this. It's I could probably do a whole a whole webinar just on masking. But anyway, what I want to do, I can do pretty quickly and simply, and that's I'm going to use two things: the gradual gradient mask, and when I click on that, you'll see that this edge aware thing appears, and I'll explain that in just a second. So this gradual tool, this is you can rotate this around. So this way it's affecting the bottom, this way it's affecting the top. And normally with a gradient, it's just kind of a smooth gradient. I'm going to move this down just a little bit. But if you look over at the right on my mask here, it cut a perfect edge along the horizon. And I love this thing it's so fast, and that's the edge aware part of this. If I bring the edge aware down to 0, then if you look over here on the right where the gradient is, you can see that that's more or less a normal gradient, and I could expand it out, contract it just the way you normally would see a gradient tool. What's unique about this and really cool is this edge aware thing, because it just cuts an edge on the horizon like instantaneously. If I were in any other program, even if it had really good masking, I'd still have to use a brush and brush all along that horizon to get it to look like this. So my sky is pretty good, except at the very top here it's a little bit dark. So what I'm going to do is just grab the brush and fill in the mask a little more. Now I don't want to mask it back completely, but probably around, oops, sorry, I want to grab my brush first. Probably around 50–60%, something like that. We'll try it and see. And then I want to get the right size brush. I can use a fairly big brush for this. And then I'll just kind of brush along here. See how we do. And I missed a little spot right there. So you can see that lightens it up a little bit. What I did is I didn't use a solid black. So those of you that aren't that familiar with masking, white reveals. So if it's pure white, 100%, and black conceals, and if it's pure black, 100%, and the gray is in between. So what we did is we masked out the effect on the bottoms. So we just wanted to isolate the sky, and then I did a partial mask on just the very top there, so that I have, so it isn't quite as dark as it was. So I think that takes care of things exposure-wise, but now I want to bring back some of that texture and get a sense of depth, and the perfect thing for that is precision contrast. Precision contrast is one of those, if you don't buy any other pro adjustment, get contrast, because it really I use it on almost every image, because if nothing else, it adds a nice sense of depth. In this case, we really want to kind of bring out a lot of texture too. So what precision contrast does, it's pretty aptly named. It allows you precise adjustment of contrast, and it divides it in, over on the right here, you can see under contrast, it divides it into 4 sections, micro up to high. Now what micro and low are basically areas where there's very little difference from one tone to the next, even, like 1 pixel to the next, but if you think of it in terms of tones. For instance, if you look in this area right here in this sort of valley that's in the shadow, there's very little difference in contrast. So if I take this micro slider and bring that up, you can see that coming back quite a bit, as well as some of those areas in the cloud, in the clouds that were pretty low. So I'm going to bring that up quite a bit. And then I'll do the low contrast, which is sort of the next category. Bring that up a little more. And I'll do probably the same with the medium. Now what happens is, as you start building contrast with these 3 sliders, the extremes become more extreme. So your highlights can start to burn out, and your shadows can start to block up the dark areas. And so it's not uncommon to have this high slider going to the negative. So I'm going to bring that back just a little bit. Now there's some other tweaks I can do in here too. And I'm gonna do those too. For instance, you have this whole lighting section and then a color section. In the lighting section, the main thing I'm looking at is, if you look at my clouds, the highlights are kind of burning out. So I can take the highlights and bring those down quite a bit, so that I'm bringing some detail back into these shadows. Now there's these 3 buttons, low, medium, and high, for equalization. That, if those of you that have used adjust, it's a little bit similar to that, in that it balances the exposure, so the highlights don't get blown, the shadows don't get blocked up, and you have a choice of low, medium, and high. So it's just another little tweak here. If I put it on low, you can see the whole thing overall is more contrasty. Medium and then high, it kind of equals it out a little more. So I'm good with either the medium or the high. I'd say we'll leave it on medium. It just gives us a little more drama, and we still have plenty of texture in those clouds. It doesn't bother me that we have, you know, a solid white highlight here, because that's, you know, technically in a good print, especially when you're doing black and white, you want everything from the lightest to the darkest and all the tones in between. So one more thing, actually, I think I'm just going to bump up the saturation a little bit. And the reason I'm doing this, you might say, wow, this image looks kind of gaudy. And that's, if you ever saw my black and white webinar, I think I've done a couple of them now for Topaz. I recommend making your color photo look a little bit gaudy and a little bit saturated, kind of saturated and contrasty, and that usually makes for a nice black and white conversion. So I mean, I wouldn't use this as a color photo anyway, but if I did, it's a little overcooked here. And what I'm going to do now is bring up my black and white. And we've already got a pretty good conversion here. All I have to do is a few little tweaks. So it starts out with a neutral conversion, and then you have all these, the reason you have colors in here is it's using the color information in the photo to allow you to make adjustments to certain tonal areas. So in this case, what you can do is you can just click this off, remind yourself what colors are in the image. So in this, it's sort of greens and yellows mostly. Looks like there's a little bit of blue in there. So I kind of have an idea what I want to do. The yellow areas I'm going to bring up to add a little contrast. Those are sort of the areas where you have that dappled light on these rolling hills. And the green, what you can do is, you know, you bring these sliders to an extreme to see where it's affecting it. I'm going to back it off because I just want to bump it up a little bit. And the same thing I'm going to do with the green slider. If I bring that all the way to the left, you can see that it's making some areas darker. And I want to do that, not quite this much, but I want a little bit of extra contrast. So I'm going to take my green down, maybe something like that. So I think we have a really nice black and white here. And what I'll do is I'll go up here and hit the side by side so you can see the before and after. So from the whole process, it's just looking at the scene, kind of visualizing in my head what I want it to look like based on what I want to say. You know, a successful image tells a story or conveys an emotion or just kind of what you felt when you saw this, and you want to try to convey that to the viewer. And so now we're at the point where first I did it in the capture, and now I'm honing that to this finalized black and white. So right now, I think I'll jump over to sort of the next stage of these visualization exercises that I suggest to people when I do workshops and whatnot. So the second one has to do with raw plus JPEG. You remember that our raw images, as we just saw, are lackluster compared to our original scene. So the first visualization practice was comparing the scene to your mind's eye image to the capture you see on the back of the camera, or if you have a mirrorless camera, what you see in the viewfinder. So that image you see on the back of your camera viewfinder, or in your viewfinder if you have a mirrorless, is a JPEG. And a lot of people don't realize that. They might think they're looking at a raw image, but you're not, and your histogram is also based on JPEG. The only exception I know to that is the Leica Monochrome M, which you can actually set that to be raw. So with this in mind, you want to be cognizant of what your JPEG settings are on your camera. And because the camera is doing the processing, that's what's happening when you set saturation, contrast, sharpness, all that on your JPEG settings in your camera. And there are two good reasons to set this up. The first is that you can set things to your preferences, so you can set the kind of saturation and contrast and the look you want, which helps you compare your visualization in the field. But secondly, it gives you a reference point for what you wanted when you're back at your computer. If you only shoot raw, then your only reference is your memory, and it isn't that accurate. Our brains can't remember precise colors very well at all. I mean, it's that whole thing that we say, you know, 5 people say red, they're talking about a totally different red. And even if you show them one and show it to them again 5 minutes later, you really can't remember the precise color. So those are two good reasons for shooting raw. And so what I recommend doing, you can do this in Lightroom, you can do it right in Topaz Studio, is to bring up some images, both the raw and the JPEG. Now this is the raw, it's pretty lackluster, and then hopefully you're seeing this come up. It's a fairly big difference. It's much more vivid color, more contrasty, and this is from the JPEG settings in my camera. So this gives me a reference point later. If I mean, when you get really good at the visualization, you may not use the JPEGs as much for reference, but I think it's a good idea both for in the field and later on to have those as reference. So in terms of taking this a little further with artistic visualization, I'm just going to show you some images here. I tend to be attracted to painterly scenes, and it's part of my vision, and some would say my style, but really it's just part of visualizing in my mind's eye. And so kind of no matter what the subject, I often am attracted to and create these sort of painterly photographs. So even though I seek to capture that painterly feel through a straight photograph, we've got all these tools in Topaz. First came Simplify, then Impression came along, and it allowed me to go way beyond just a painterly feel to a photograph. So now I can visualize something as a painting, even if it isn't a candidate for a straight photograph. So let me show you an example, and I'll run through it. So first, let's go back to our single view, and let's go to this image here. Now I saw these dogs in Sicily, and the bottom one reminded me of one of my all-time favorite dogs. And frankly, as a photograph, it really isn't great. There's nothing much to it. But I think it ends up making kind of a nice painting. So this is my end game. Now let's go back to the photograph a minute. So if you look at this, it's very busy. There's a lot of detail that's just sort of extraneous. And I want to essentially simplify that and make it more painterly so that the focus is just kind of on the image of these two dogs and not all of the other stuff. Plus, it just works a lot better as a painting, I think. So the first thing I want to do is simplify this, and I do that with an adjustment called Abstraction. Now, this is pretty well exposed. Sharpness is not a huge concern since I'm going to a painting, but it looks pretty good as a starting point. So my first adjustment is going to be Abstraction, which the analogous plug into this would be Simplify. And you can see that's the first slider on here. So although Impression is the thing to use for painting, sometimes I start with Abstraction just to simplify my image before I go to the painting. So it's sort of like the same way I did some preparation on my color image to go to black and white. Sometimes I use Abstraction as sort of a prep to go to kind of a painting look, or to a painting period, because that's what Impression ends up doing for us. So if you see, as I bring in this Simplify size slider, it does just that. It gets rid of all the detail. It just kind of sees the major shapes and forms and colors and that sort of thing. And that's really what I'm after, because everything else in that as a photo is just kind of too distracting. And in fact, I keep a preset for that. So, and by the term preset, if you look up here in all of these adjustments, you'll see a pull down called preset. And that allows you to save off a combination of settings within an adjustment. And this is kind of a big deal. I mean, over here on the left, we have effects, and those are combinations of adjustments. and that's the way some other programs work too, that they call presets. But what's cool about this is you can go down another level and have a preset of just the adjustments for that. The sliders and settings for that adjustment. So you see I have this one called painting prep. And mainly it's just bringing the simplify slider up. I add a little detail strength. So this first step here for abstraction just simplifies it for me. And I'll show you after I add the impression layer and kind of turn it into a painting, you'll see why I'm using that. So just to give you the context, let me go to impression. There it is, palette, knife, and oil. So I can click on that, and that gives me pretty close to the effect that I had before, which was this one, okay? There's a couple reasons I like to do the abstraction first. First of all, when I do this, it's getting rid of any other settings I had in here. And that's really the whole idea behind these effects, is it's giving you a combination of adjustments. In this case, with impression, there's so many settings in impression. A lot of these painting effects are just a host of settings within impression. So there's really different ways to do this. You can do it like this with these effects, or you can have presets in here too. So there's my palette, knife, and oil. And the reason that I saved it off in here is because I do like to use the abstraction adjustment first as a basis for my painting. So I'm going to go back to that abstraction, and I'm going to go to my painting prep. And this way I can add an impression adjustment, and I can go into my palette, knife, and oil. Okay. So now what I'm going to show you is why I wanted to simplify it first with abstraction, because if I get rid of that, you can see it's a little busier. There's more variation in color, there's just a lot more brush strokes, and this is just a quick and easy way to kind of smooth that out. So really, I'm almost kind of done here just by using an effect, and that's one of the great things about Studio and these adjustments, and particularly ones like impression, where there's so many different things that you can do with it. So I'm just gonna tweak this a little bit. One thing I want to do actually before I even go into impression is, and I'll shut this off just so we can see it. In the abstraction, what happened here that is I lost a little bit in this dog's eyes on the bottom, and so I'm just going to mask that out. We saw the masking before, and this is just really quick and easy. I can take the brush, and right now the whole effect is on there, so I'm going to leave it on black to take some of that out. And I'm going to go to a pretty small brush. In fact, let me enlarge this so that you can see it better. And I'm just going to go over the dog's eyes. Now, this is going to look a little strange because you can see the photographic realism in the eyes here against this sort of somewhat painterly look I did with abstraction. But once we add impression to that, this is just really serving to make them stand out a little bit more. And then the eyebrows were kind of important too. So let's mask those a little bit so that they show up better. Okay, now let me turn this back on, and you can see where we're at. We're back to our painterly look, and there's a little more life in this dog's face by seeing his eyes and his eyebrows, or her eyes and eyebrows. I'm not sure whether they're male or female. So there's really one more thing that I wanted to do here, and that is, if you notice on this, and this can happen a lot when you're using painting effects and using impression, is with these brush strokes, there's a few areas where there's no paint, so to speak. Okay, and if I enlarge it, you can see, you know, there's just these spots in there like this. Now I could find some way to go in and fill those, but I'm going to show you a neat little trick and some other adjustments you can do in impressions. So even though, and I would, you know, I would love to go over every one of these settings in here, but that would be a whole webinar unto itself. And in fact, I did one a while back on impression that I go into quite a bit of detail on what these things do. And those you can find on my website and on the Topaz YouTube channel. So what I want to do is go into the color here, and under this color panel here, it's really cool. It's like the HSL panel, so you can isolate different colors. And so there's a few things I want to change about this. First of all, I do like the blue against the yellow orangish dog because those are complementary colors, but the blue is a little bit too vivid, a little bit overwhelming, and there's a lot of blues in the street, and I don't know how necessary they really are. So I'm going to adjust those so that we can accentuate the dogs a little more and the backpack and street a little less. So the first thing I can do is take down the brightness a little. Actually, I'm going to bring up the brightness because that'll lighten it. So let's maybe up around there, and then I'm going to bring down the saturation a bit. And it's kind of subtle, but it does, I think it just takes away some of the distraction and accentuates the dogs a little more. And by making the street lighter, the dark dog is showing up better. Now there's one thing that's kind of nagging at me, and that's this bucket over here that has really nothing to do with the scene other than it happens to be there. And it's a bright, bright red. So in theory, I could click on the red here and bring that down. The problem is, you see when you hover over these, you get these red bars that shows you where each of those colors is, and that's really handy. So you can see when I hover over the red, it's a little hard to see, but there's a lot of red in the dog that's on top of the bench there. And so if I do click on the red here, and I bring down the saturation, you can see, or the lightness, you can see that a lot of those red hues in the dog are going gray. So there is a good solution to this, and that is to create another Hsl layer. Now, before I do that, I'm going to show you one of my little tricks here. We were talking about these little white patches that you sometimes get in the painting. And what I did is I went into texture here, and the texture is what gives you your background canvas. So if I go up to 100% here, it makes it easier to see. So right now I'm on canvas 5. You see the texture strength is at 20. If I bring that all the way up, you can see the pebbly texture of this canvas, and that's great if you want that look, and that's what this strength slider is for. In this case, I'm not that concerned about the texture of the canvas showing through. But one thing that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of is back here in background type, it says solid and original. Solid means where it is now that you have this background canvas. You can, if you click on original, it makes your photograph, the base photo, it makes your background. So watch what happens when I click this. Voila, I got rid of all those little white spots, and that is a really quick and easy way to go in there rather than trying to retouch or find some other way to do it. And let me back up to that again. So that's a pretty slick way to do it. So the only thing I have left to do here is to get rid of that sort of red bucket there. And what I'm going to do, I mentioned before, I'm going to add an Hsl layer. So some of you might have been thinking, I had these Hsl settings in impression, and why couldn't I just bring those in there and then mask out the dog? And the answer to that is that you would be masking out all of the effects in impression. So here, by creating a separate layer, separate adjustment for Hsl Color Tuning, it's essentially those same controls, but now I can mask out the effect without without it affecting my impression layer. So what I can do is click on this red, bring down the saturation. You can see the bucket goes gray over here. It's too light, and I think that's distracting. So I'm going to bring it down so that it's fairly dark. Now, that may be overdone, but like I said before, I kind of like to do things, overdo things a little bit than under, because I can always tweak this back. But the one thing I have left to do, which was the whole purpose of this layer, is to make use of the mask again. And this is pretty easy. I can just take, I can actually, probably the best thing to do is just invert the mask and then just paint the effect back in just where I want it, which is the bucket. I can make a bigger brush here. And it doesn't really matter if I go over the lines here, because I'm only affecting, whoops, I had my transparency down to 0. What I want is white, because remember, white reveals and black conceals. So let me try that again. And there we are. And if that's a little too dark, I always have the option here of taking my opacity slider and letting some of that color come back in. And I think that's good right about there. And let's take a look at the before and after again. And there we are. A kind of a mundane photo, but I think it makes a nice simple painting of these two dogs. So in light of all of the different options that you have for something like impression, and glow is another one where it's virtually unlimited, all the different variations you can do. You'll end up with favorites, but in terms of tying this into visualization, let me go to my little visualization exercises here. So you can do the same thing I just said with the raw and JPEG, but just do it with different effects. Those ones on the left that are sort of preset effects. So pick an image that you want to be transformed, and I'm using the word transformed here because we're not talking about dealing with it as a straight photograph, but going to a whole other level with things like impression and glow and restyle and the various ones that have pretty dramatically different looks than a photo. So same deal, you know, you look at your first image, you go to your little thumbnails in Studio, and then apply an effect and see. And once you do this enough and go back and forth, you will sort of train your brain to visualize some of these. Now, they might not be real precise visualizations, but it gives you an idea. And that's one of the reasons, actually, that let me go back here, that I use this word discovery. All right, let's see. So, all right, and I can show you right here. So here's that image, and I'll go to some of my favorites here. So you can just try some of these different ones. The palette knife and oil is one of my favorites, and let me just see if this this little button that I pushed up here, this HD preview, is kind of handy. What it does is it gives you, when you're looking at the overall image, it gives you the high resolution version of it. So it's the same as blowing it up to 100% to see the final effect, but you can see it when you're looking at an overall view. So the same idea here with teaching yourself the visualization is just look at these little thumbnails, close your eyes, and try to visualize your original image, which was this one, in some of these different effects, just by clicking over here. And you notice when I click on those, over on the right here are all the various adjustments that were used to make this. And this particular one, called Lightning Lines, I got from the public button up here. This allows you to share or to see other effects that other Topaz users have created. And you can, it gives you access to a lot more. It already comes with a couple hundred, I think, at least, and you get that many more here. This particular one, if you do the info, it gives you the user's name. In this case, it was Topaz that contributed it. This one, Lightning Lines, was someone else. It was, I think, Arab, A-R-A-B. So whoever that is, thank you. This is a very cool effect. Anyway, you get the idea. So I think it's just to kind of continue with the whole visualization thing, try going back and forth with some of these.
If you guys like to follow Joel, he showed a little bit of his website. You should definitely check it out at joelwolfson.com. You can also visit his blog at joelwolfson.com/blog. And if you have any questions you'd like to email him, he would love to hear from you. You can email him at info@joelwolfson.com. If you have questions, you can contact us directly at webinars@topazlabs.com and sign up for upcoming webinars at topazlabs.com/webinars. Guys, thank you so much for attending. We almost completely maxed out, Joel. I think we had like 30 seats left. So it was a fantastic webinar.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. And I always enjoy these, and I hope to be back soon to do another one.
Yeah, we'd love to have
you. So all of you have a great day, evening, whatever it is in your time zone.